I don't wanna leave. But you won't let me stay. Hey! Yes! I don't wanna leave.
Hi, I'm Nojave. In this video, I'm going to be looking back through Fallout 4 and how it's changed now that all the DLC is out. I'm going to be looking at Automaton, at Far Harbor, at the Wasteland Workshop, and also at Survival Mode. We're going to be talking about how all of them change the base experience, or highlight certain portions of the base experience. Anyway, it's a long journey, so let's get started. I've always felt like the pulp comic book direction that Bethesda sometimes takes Fallout in is a bad one. It's not like it's out of place. The installation screen of the very first Fallout game is done up like a comic book cover itself, a man and woman in form-fitting vault suits climbing above a horde of ghouls in green mist. There's nothing amongst the silly, ridiculous stuff that Bethesda does in Fallout 3 and 4 that doesn't have an equally ridiculous counterpart in Fallout 2. Still, when I heard the first major Fallout 4 DLC would be bringing back the Mechanist from Fallout 3, I wasn't too happy about it. The shallow and melodramatic conflict between the Mechanist and the Antagonizer highlighted a wide range of complaints I have about the quality of writing in Bethesda Fallouts, primarily that it's based more on memorable concepts and deliberate gags than on detailed character and world building. Superheroes are a nifty-fifties kind of thing. Why not tap into the vibe of that late Golden Age, early Silver Age period of superhero comics? Put that in the game. In Fallout 3, the Mechanist was part of a straightforward quest chain called the Superhuman Gambit. Support the doer of good, or the doer of evil if you're into that, or kill both of them if they're annoying to you and you want their things. In Fallout 4, the Mechanist is a more complicated chain of quests with a more complicated set of motivations that helps flesh out the lore and depth of Fallout 4's particular focus on artificial life. It's smarter than Fallout 3, but it's more linear than most of Fallout 3 as well. The DLC of Fallout 4 really isn't what I expected on the whole. You've got Automaton, and then you've got the zero-plot customization expansion, Wasteland Workshop, and then finally you've got Far Harbor, which is no less than an honest-to-God expansion pack, roughly equivalent in depth, quality, and length to the Shivering Isles expansion for Elder Scrolls 4. There's also the free survival mode, which was recently patched in, which is like hardcore mode for New Vegas, but with more structural and mechanical changes. Fallout 4 itself was one of the biggest enigmas of a game I've played recently. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a well-designed game for someone else, that there was someone out there for whom Fallout 4 was the perfect Fallout experience, but I knew that person wasn't me. The new DLCs are very illuminating in trying to figure out the balance of the game. What makes Fallout 4 what it is, and why? Each new piece of content pulls at a different thread of the Fallout 4 experience, takes an element that was evenly blended in the original version, and gives it focus and prominence. For Wasteland Workshop, it was the settlement mechanics. For Far Harbor, it was exploration and dialogue. For Survival Mode, it's combat and crafting. For Automaton, it's that comic book feel of the world. One of the most in-depth and well-liked quests of the base game is the Silver Shroud questline, where you don the gear of a pre-war masked avenger. In the quest, you go around righting the wrongs that the post-apocalypse would otherwise let pass unnoticed and take down a ring of murderers and thieves, all the while leaving the Shroud's calling cards at the scene of the action. Automaton allows you to play through its entire length pretty much in character as the Silver Shroud. You can also play it straight and show up in power armor. The plot and different outcomes don't really change that much if you do, but you'll lose much of the spirit. Automaton is a superhero story, where instead of choosing between the Mechanist and Antagonizer, you, the player, are the protagonist, and the Mechanist is always the villain, and the story plays out in its melodramatic and ridiculous way, whether that tone suits the player or not. So, the game lets the player adopt this secret identity, the Silver Shroud, whose ridiculousness feels more appropriate to the story. That said, Automaton is still more creative than just a high-budget version of the Superhuman Gambit quest. Focusing on robots, with their rigid, artificial, and sometimes delusional ways of looking at the world, helps highlight what's special about the Institute's technology and synths like Nick. In the beginning of the Automaton quest chain, you run across a robot who explains why the Mechanist armies are gunning down everyone in the wasteland. They're here to help. The Mechanist has given them a simple instruction: help everyone in the Commonwealth. At first they were friendly, but more often than not intervening in the lives of settlers and scavengers created more problems than it solved. Kindness was not helping. Life is hard and complicated. What would help everyone best is if they were all cold and in the ground. It's the simplest, most elegant solution if these robots are supposed to help absolutely everyone. Less people, less problems, no people, no problems. Wasteland helped. The question for the player is whether or not this is what the Mechanist intended. Are they a deliberate villain or a careless one? To discover the Mechanist layer, you'll have to build a robot that acts like a kind of walking key to the installation. This will fork the DLC in its two directions, towards a pretty interesting but otherwise linear journey into the world of robotic ethics, and into a whole new customization suite just for robots at your settlement. The Mechanist layer is one of the few things in Fallout 4 that feels tightly connected to the lineage of the franchise as a whole, since it reaches deep into the Fallout tradition. In the Theyre Army Depot in Fallout 2, you had the opportunity to extract the brain of one of your traveling companions and stuff it into a robo-brain chassis, or else use one of the brains provided, sitting in storage for hundreds of years. Well, the Theyre Army Depot wasn't the only such facility. The Mechanist layer is where robo-brains were mass-produced, harvested from the brains of criminals and dissidents. As you explore the facility, you'll find logs from the various heads of robo-brain development and security, some of whom felt a zeal for progress at all costs, some of whom had moral objections and were ultimately removed from the project, and a few who were just regular old cowards, doing evil knowingly to collect the paycheck. Still, you learn the history of the robo-brains. Most of them are crazy, which is why the ones wandering the wastelands of previous games are so frequently hostile. It's brute force science, churning through hundreds and hundreds of human subjects, all of whom had their brains extracted to make incremental improvements in the design. The worst criminals were often preferred for the combat models. When you look at what the Institute is doing, creating doppelgangers that allow them to influence the Commonwealth as they please from a distance, it seems more humane. You know, for an authoritarian sci-fi power grab. The synths are subtle, they feel things, they are their own creatures, yet are still designed to perceive things from a human perspective. The robo-brains are like technological cannibalism, treating humans and human consciousness as a mechanical part to be assembled and disassembled. Pure robots are earnest in what they are, and are only really capable of unhappiness when they can't fulfill their function. Think of Codsworth's near breakdown of the state of the kitchen linoleum in a post-nuclear world. As fractured a narrative as Fallout 4 has, letting you complete parts of it intermittently over dozens of hours, one thing it does accomplish from a science fiction perspective is showcasing what a diversity of approaches and possibilities there are for artificial consciousness. A robo-brain is a robot who used to be a human, a synth is a robot who's designed to mimic a human, and a run-of-the-mill robot does what it's programmed to do, and its limited capacity to interpret that programming. The Mechanist as a villain is not very impressive. She's misguided, not evil, a woman who read the Mechanist comics once upon a time, and when she discovered this facility, sought to restore order and justice to the wasteland using the broken and amoral tools of the past. It was never going to work out. You can speak to her as the Shroud, but when the fighting is over and the realizations are made, she gives you the costume and you speak as regular folks, wastelander to wastelander. It was an earnest mistake, made out of foolish idealism. The technology behind the facility, though, that was a deliberate cruelty. The Mechanist's mistake was scale. If you want a genuinely helpful robot, you've got to do it carefully, one robot at a time. Fallout 4's interpretation of what player choice really means in terms of impact has always skewed much further toward the mechanical systems than towards the dialogue and plot. You can choose how you deal with the Mechanist, your attitude, and if she lives or dies, but whether or not you're kind or cruel, something like 95% of your experience playing Automaton remains the same. It's in the robot customization that you get the choice. Do you want Codsworth to have tank treads, or maybe a lightning coil for an arm? It's a tremendous amount of player choice, but it's kind of strange. There's definitely a lot of fun to be had with Automaton's robotic accessorizing, but it came at the expense of more story and new environments. Automaton can take 3 hours or so, but it feels much slighter than many of the Fallout 3 DLCs. Even the ones I'm not too fond of, like Mothership Zeta and Operation Anchorage, felt like massive and distinct additions to the world. They were departures from the main game world. Automaton is not. It's half cosmetic DLC, and I think it's perfectly fair to argue that juggling different armor statistics on your robots is fundamentally cosmetic, and the other half feels almost too straightforward to be true. There's very little to explore that's new in terms of the game world, just a few new dungeons and a few new excuses to go to old dungeons. Wasteland Workshop, the second DLC, hugely compounded my frustration with how DLC was being handled so far in Fallout 4. It's all about adding new mechanics to settlements, like setting traps in the wild for enemy creatures who can make fight in arenas you build in town. So, like Thunderdome, but modular and highly customizable. Most of everything in the DLC is just expanding the number of architectural and decorative choices you've got in the Settlement Workshop. It's the Fallout 4 Live Large expansion. Wasteland Workshop completely defies the expectations someone would have for Fallout 4 based off of how Fallout 3 and New Vegas went about it. In terms of how much I enjoyed it personally, I'd rank it tentatively above horse armor. That's the thing, though. I'm just not the target demographic for this DLC. Fallout 4 is a deliberately forward-thinking game in terms of how people are consuming games these days. I still use the arrow keys. That's so outmoded that the PC version never even expected the arrow keys to be used for movement, so it uses them in Workshop without letting you rebind them. When I first played, I thought you had to stand still every time you placed an object on account of it, until folks in the comments puzzled it out for me that the problem was more or less a personal one. Fallout 4 is meant to appeal to all the people who have come to gaming recently, and for many of these people, especially young people, their entry point into the hobby is Minecraft. The prevailing wisdom is that the ability of the player to reshape the world in a physical, tangible, deliberate way is more appealing than the kind of long-range plot consequences that games like New Vegas need ending slides to keep track of. For New Vegas, the DLCs were deeply intricate in their plot and their level design, but you left them with little more than memories and a new weapon or two. In Fallout 4, the story is about the player, about the lone survivor, and how the wasteland bends and twists to please them. Wasteland Workshop is about taking pockets of a wild, dire apocalypse and turning them into whatever the hell you happen to want. Besides, it's not too different in spirit from the Hearthfire DLC for Skyrim, although the fact that the DLC scheme is closer to Skyrim than New Vegas is still frustrating to me. The funny thing is, while I thought that the Wasteland Workshop was pretty pointless while I was playing on normal game modes, the new survival mode made me actually enjoy a good section of it. It's not the DLC I wanted, but I'll grudgingly admit that it's a perfectly appropriate DLC for Fallout 4. Survival mode taught me a lot about Fallout 4, and I think it's a DLC in itself, albeit a free one that does nothing but recontextualize existing mechanics. It recontextualizes the living shit out of those mechanics, though. I felt like I was having a real role-playing experience for the first time in a long time with Fallout 4. Not a high-concept narrative campaign like previous campaigns, where you feel like your character is affecting the world around them, but in a vividly personal and immediate way, where I felt more like the world was affecting me instead, and I reacted as if I was present in the situation, in a way that I usually don't when I'm playing a character in a more traditional way. Here's what they change in survival mode. Everyone does double damage at all times. You do double damage, they do double damage. All combat is faster and more brutal. You have to eat, you have to drink, you have to sleep, you can contract disease, carry weight is reduced, ammunition has weight, and you can only save your game by sleeping in a bedroll or a real bed. All autosaves are disabled, and so is fast travel. You have to walk everywhere. So, here's how it plays out. You need somewhere to call home, somewhere you have a source of food and water, somewhere you can store and accumulate valuables, somewhere that offers refuge and healing. Because out there, you are always dying. Each mile is a victory of sorts, and you play in increments of days, not doorways. In the regular game, you autosave every level transition. You can quick save in conversations. You choose outcomes from a number of options, but seldom is there a compelling reason to accept a negative outcome. There are many procedurally generated quests in Fallout 4, so the game is impossible to truly 100%, but in a normal game mode, you can complete the majority of quests and most every flavor of repeating quest and expect success, to have it be part of your character's journey. In survival mode, you accept mistakes and failures and then incorporate them into your character's overall journey alongside your heroic successes. For example, I had just arrived at Finch Farm. I was clicking to skip dialogue, but accidentally shot the farmer right in the gut, causing everyone to attack. In another mode, I would just reload the game, but in this mode, my last save was half an hour of white-knuckle combat and scavenging ago. Taking back my accidental discharge meant losing the entire day's games, so I killed everyone at Finch Farm and slept in their beds. And it wouldn't be the last time I murdered for something petty in the game either. Being the good guy in a game is easy when the game is easy, like in BioShock. There really isn't much of a penalty for sacrifice and taking the moral high ground. But in survival mode, all this junk in your inventory is worth something. It's worth the time you spent finding it, the care you took selecting it over other junk in your reduced and limited inventory, and it gets to the point where it feels like maybe it is worth killing over. Giving something away, like caps or medicine, hurts you. Doing something without asking for a reward hurts you. To actually play a good character in survival mode, a moral character, you have to sacrifice in a meaningful way. And no matter how kind my character is in the future, I still killed a man and his whole family because I wanted him to be quiet and needed somewhere to sleep. The binary morality of the writing matters so much less when your mechanical gameplay decisions take on complicated moral dimensions. That's a hell of a trick for survival mode to accomplish. It made me appreciate the role-playing value of the scavenging and crafting systems I had found shallow playing the regular way. The missing thing, the thing that made my whole Fallout 4 experience feel incomplete, was consequence. I've seen the vast majority of what the game has to offer, but it all feels new when you can't even fast travel. The slowness of the pacing is part of the thrill. Survival mode is best in the early and mid-game. Later on, I've heard it kinda starts to break mechanically. I have no interest in playing a completionist playthrough of my survival mode character, though. Each day is new. I start at the bed where I last slept, and move on until I find the next one. Sometimes I go and do a quest, sometimes I go hunting for a particular crafting material, sometimes I spend the whole day in Sanctuary farming moot fruit. It's sad that I killed Finch because his question to the lone survivor, "Do you think you'd ever be the type to settle down and farm?" was laughable the first time I played the game and prophetic the second time with survival mode. I cleaned up the whole neighborhood, put beds and rugs in all the houses, and tore down the houses that had collapsed. I left some of the cars on the side of the road for visual flavor, and I fixed up the lone survivor's house. And I gotta admit, the message prompt, "Scrap Sean's crib," it was also an actual role-playing moment, accomplished with a crafting interface. The protagonist's world is gone forever. What does it mean to live in the new world? I know what happens to Sean as a player who's beaten the game, but from the character's perspective, would they really follow so quickly? Would they really set out immediately into the dangerous unknown to die time after time after time? Or would they compromise, tempering hope with pragmatism? Survival mode forces these role-playing questions. It's the missing piece of Fallout 4's puzzle, the thing that makes all the shallowness of the script almost beside the point. And the shallowness of the Wasteland Workshop. As I was redecorating the lone survivor's bedroom, I put up a picture of a kitten, laid down a rug, and then installed a television that didn't work, a radio that did, and put in a bed and a chair that's just useful for sitting a while. No matter what radiated monstrosities were out there, this place, this house, was still mine. It was still home. Home is an elusive and powerful concept in a game like this, and survival mode, in concert with the subtle mechanics in the Wasteland Workshop, makes your home truly yours in a way that's personally meaningful. And you'll make several homes for yourself eventually. If you're operating in the south, you can't very well walk all the way back to Sanctuary when you need something. Each new region requires a new home, which is its own process and labor getting set up. All the details of statistics and scavenging seem to make more sense. Armors work differently too in survival mode. They matter more, and power armor actually does make you close to bulletproof, for a time. Survival mode does to the mechanics of the software what the player might do to a rad stag in the game world under survival mode. It uses the whole damn animal for once. Far Harbor, the final and largest DLC, took me by complete surprise. I had settled into the new ways of doing things in Fallout 4 and made my peace with the complexities I like and the simplifications that I don't. I wasn't expecting Fallout 4 to ever actually give me what I asked for in the first place, but with Far Harbor, it up and did. Point Lookout in Fallout 3 was its most interesting and sizable DLC, and Far Harbor has a beat in every arena. The rhythms of gameplay are much closer to Fallout 3 and New Vegas as well, where exploration is more about curiosity and pleasure than Fallout 4's scavenger hunts. There's so much to like about Far Harbor, but the most remarkable thing about it, to me, is the environment. It's as much a wasteland as any desert, but cold and waterlogged. The swamps of Fallout 4 were, visually, one of my favorite areas of the game, even if there wasn't much to actually experience in them. Far Harbor takes that irradiated murkwater aesthetic further, expresses it on a grander scale and in subtler ways. I felt like Fallout 4 was a little too mired in nostalgia for the old world, that by making the protagonist a pre-war type and emphasizing what was lost over what was built in its place, the game had thematically handicapped itself. Far Harbor, in a way no Fallout title yet has, made me really appreciate how the apocalypse transforms the landscape and how the people relate to it in turn. Previous games orient themselves around pre-war landmarks and routes. New Vegas, for instance, uses old freeway interchanges to create the boundaries of difficulty regions. Trade routes run along them. The expansionist government of the NCR imitates governments of the past and uses the infrastructure of the old world. The capital wasteland is dominated by urban planning decisions made well before the bombs fell, and although it is a huge region, you still use old metro landmarks to navigate the great majority of it. It's in the DLC that you really get to go out in the wild places of the world. Post-nuclear Zion in Honest Hearts, the rusted hell of Pittsburgh in the Pit, and now Far Harbor for Fallout 4. Far Harbor feels the least tame out of all of them. There are streets, neighborhoods, tidy seaside cul-de-sacs of crumbling vacation homes, but none of them are really marked on your map. They're not points of interest. They're relics of the past, sinking into the mud as the new world hangs on by a fingernail. Being designed as endgame content was a huge advantage for Far Harbor. It meant that making everything as menacing, powerful, and strange as possible right off the bat was the direction that they were already going to run with it. The town of Far Harbor is almost all that's left of civilized habitation on the island. The rest is fog, monsters, and ruin. The radioactive mist is one of the best environmental features of the expansion, even if it probably did start out as the obligatory Stephen King reference. The Mist, talking now about the King short story and surprisingly good film adaptation, also inspired a creature or two in the game, but the references are not over the top or distracting, because the game's use of mist succeeds in inspiring dread the same way that the stories do, just as strongly. It's a peer of its inspirational material, not derivative of them, at least in this element. Like the glowing sea in Fallout 4, having the extent of the devastation obscured makes a big difference in atmosphere. You know there's dangers and riches out there, but you won't know until they're right on top of you. The glowing sea, though, is barren and completely uninhabitable, aside from the children of Adam, who revel in the poison. Far Harbor is just barely inhabitable, and that is key. Outside the town, the people who live among the monsters and rubble will do anything to survive. There's a missing person quest, and you follow their trail until where they sustained an injury and were dragged off. A nearby group of island natives casually admits to cooking and eating him, talking to you like you're a goddamn idiot to even consider wasting the meat. People become enveloped in the fog, only to be seen years later as a ghoul. And on top of it, you're almost always taking radiation damage and being hunted by the massive and vicious fauna of post-nuclear Maine. When you couple this with how the environment almost completely disregards the old street patterns and landmarks of the pre-war world, you end up with something that feels completely wild and untamed. Maine, after all, was once an isolated and savage part of the landscape in real life too, but civilization took the fight out of a lot of it many decades ago. Part of the aesthetic of Far Harbor is seeing nature reclaim what's hers, giving the feeling that humans were never really meant to have any ownership over this place. That's reinforced by how, although the landscape is obviously poisoned and amplified by the radiation, it's still lush in its own sick way. There are forests and falling leaves, awful angry brush, signs that humans are hardly the only creatures to have adapted and pushed back against the end of the world. Far Harbor is truly post-apocalypse. It's moved on from the damage caused a long time ago. I enjoyed how verdant the Commonwealth was back in the main campaign, but Far Harbor is something else. It's only a wasteland to humans. To the creatures acclimated to the apocalypse, it's the beginning of a new wilderness. The environment is only one of the areas of design that got a lot of attention. The other most important is the script. Far Harbor has some of the best dialogue I've ever seen in a Bethesda RPG, and I'd put it on par with New Vegas. When describing Far Harbor before it came out, Bethesda said that it would be the largest single-content expansion since Shivering Isles for Oblivion. And there's more to that comparison than just landmass. Oblivion had a similar kind of disconnection between the player and the characters as Fallout 4 does, where mechanical design and player freedom to 100% the game can come at the expense of actual role-playing and consequence in the plot. Fallout 4 has settlements and factions, Oblivion had strongholds and guilds, but Shivering Isles was a serious break from the norm, an extraplanar excursion way more creative than the fire and brimstone plane of Oblivion. Its characters and locations were more memorable than the grand majority of template dungeons in the main campaign. So too with Far Harbor for Fallout 4, but with an added focus on making the dialogue seem more natural and thematically weighted than what's in the base game. The script of Fallout 4 took a pretty big hammering from critics and fans, although it's obviously an improvement over 3. Part of what works about Far Harbor is the scale and the time frame. It's small enough to keep everything tidy and lively, with few flat notes. Across a game as huge as Fallout 4, there's some stuff that inevitably feels like a waste of time, like almost anything Preston Garvey asks you to do, for instance. Far Harbor takes the time to make almost all the NPCs feel distinct, and to give them quests that make sense for them personally, and help the player understand the way the island's various factions and leaders interact. Even the hammiest element, the children of Adam, are given more nuanced attention than you'd expect from what was in Fallout 3 and 4. Here, the way the cult operates internally is finally discussed, and it actually makes sense. In Fallout 3, Megaton's bomb quest and the children of Adam were basically a comedic tangent. Blowing up the whole town for a mean man in a tower is a cartoon villain thing to do, and the cult was equally one-dimensional. In Far Harbor, they start with the idea that science jargon, taken out of context and given spiritual weight, would be compelling to folks born into a world whose long-lost accomplishments really might as well be divine magic. Then it shows how the savage environment of the island traps the weaker members within the cult. They wouldn't survive an escape attempt if they tried it. And then it shows how the cult habituates its members to obedience and paranoia. It's vivid. It feels like something you might see in an old-school Fallout. You kinda did, after all, with Hobologists in Fallout 2. Far Harbor's Children of Adam actually make more sense and feel more grounded than the characters and motivations of Hobology in the second game. Credit where credit's due. The writing in Far Harbor is excellent, and a lot of that excellence comes from the fantastic attention to detail and context. The frame of Far Harbor pulls on some of the better parts of Fallout 4, where you're doing post-nuclear detective work with Nick Valentine. A couple of homesteaders on the far northern beach have a daughter who's become convinced that she's a synth, and has run off to find a colony of free synths living up in Maine. When you find the colony, you'll find it being run by the only other synth in the world like Nick Valentine, his brother by assembly line, Dima. Dima's a great character, warm and cold in all the right places at all the right moments for satisfying science fiction. He also serves an important purpose in the arc of the whole game's narrative. Dima is a creation of the Institute, an escapee, but his values and methods are directly descended from theirs. The good solution to the plot involves covering up Dima's misdeeds and manipulations, which he hid even from himself. If you let it come to light that the island has been played by a robot puppet master for decades, no matter how seemingly good-natured a puppet master, there's going to be riot and there's going to be bloodshed. The status quo of the island is deadly and cruel, but it needs to be gently nudged in the right direction to improve anything for anybody, not have its most volatile personalities shaken up and made to fear each other. Since this is a Fallout game, you can also sow that fear and discord throughout the whole area and end things with massive explosions and bloodshed. But what Dima's plot is all about is that the moral choice is not between good and evil, but between order and entropy. Whatever cruelties the Institute inflicted were done to hold back a new dark age. Dima thinks he's better than the Institute, but he's just the same. And the realization comes slowly to both the player and to Dima himself. The strangest part of the DLC by far has to do with that memory loss. At the beginning of the expansion, Nick doesn't recognize the old friend asking him to make the journey. He was never intended to live for so long. His memory storage overwrites itself. He forgets. Dima's constructed his observatory sanctuary at least partly to house all of his experiences inside of databanks. The sequence is extremely derivative of Mass Effect 3's Geth mainframe levels, but you do go inside a computer program to uncover his hidden memories. There's a long sequence of puzzles, and the last is optional, and incredibly difficult. It took me a little over half an hour to figure it out, but it just goes to show you how humongous a chunk of content Far Harbor is. Some of the absolute best content in Far Harbor is hidden, too. The most notable is the Cliff's Edge Hotel, a crumbling Art Deco luxury resort with the seal of a vault out front in the parking lot rotunda. It takes a while to make your way through the hotel into the basement where the vault entrance is, but once you get there, buckle up. You're in for a goddamn robo-brain murder mystery. The original intent of Vault 118 was to pit the rich upper-class guests against the lower class, with the seal between the different habitats and control of the Overseer. But the regular guests never arrived, and the VIPs had a very important person indeed amongst them, the man in charge of the robo-brain program you uncovered in Automaton. He convinced everyone in Vault 118 to wait out the war in robo-brain bodies, and for hundreds of years now, everyone's been trying to live as they always have, in their luxury vault, and ignore the fact that the world died a long time back. This vault, Vault 118, has one of the most powerfully melancholy moments I've ever seen in a Fallout game. Any Fallout game, and I found it just by poking my nose around. Past the restrooms, pristine and unused since everyone chucked their meat bodies a long time ago, is a little cave with sand and water and a painting of a beautiful golden beach. Up on the surface, these beaches still exist, but the wonderland of recreation and health they once were is gone forever. Down here, these robot people have only a comically pale imitation of their ideal world and of their former selves, their memories and eroding dreams, and they only have each other to talk to. The residents of the vault are artists, actresses, scientists, creative types with hundreds of years to do nothing but accumulate rust and resentments. In the course of solving the murder, you get to know all of them. The quest doesn't take itself too seriously, the voice actor gets pretty hammy in a Silver Shroud kind of way, and all the characters have a comedic edge. But they're just as funny and distinct as the brain bots for Old World Blues in New Vegas, but they have even more personality and characterization than Old World Blues, which is really saying something. It's some of the best content in the entire franchise, and you're meant to simply stumble into it out of blind curiosity. That's the thing about Far Harbor. It's as understanding and committed to the priorities and rhythms of play that longtime franchise fans have developed, as the main game was interested in courting new players. It's an expertly designed expansion that's rooted to the bedrock in the lore, themes, and emotions that made the franchise so beloved. It's sometimes difficult to age alongside your favorite media. Fallout has always been one of my absolute favorites, for a good chunk of childhood and all of my adult life. When Fallout 4 came out and I struggled to get into it, it was a weird moment for me. Did I grow out of Fallout, or did Fallout grow out of me? After playing the DLC, I'm pretty confident that it's the latter. Far Harbor is everything I wanted from Fallout 4, and it gave me all the feelings of freedom, wonder, and intense connection to the game world that I'd been finding so elusive. But I also got many of those things from survival mode. What makes a person's favorite game their favorite game is a surprisingly delicate balance of complicated elements. To make a Fallout game that feels right, that feels authentic to the franchise, you have to balance art design, sound design, the tone of the script, the lay of the land, the statistics of combat, the moods of moments both violent and mundane. Any change in any of these areas alters the feel of the whole thing. New Vegas was made by many of the folks who worked on the original games, and they were very deliberate in translating what worked then into what works now. Outside of Far Harbor, Fallout 4 is divorced from that traditionalist approach. Fallout 4 wants to break free of the design expectations it's been carrying around. Bethesda wanted the freedom, as a developer, to pursue the dominant RPG trends of 2015 and onwards, not the well-worn methods of 1997. Fallout 4 is an artistic work. It contains many artistic achievements, but it was made for profit by a business. As much as I'd like to ask Bethesda to make games exactly as I like them to be, the way I'm used to, according to my design values, they're going to do what makes sense to them as a business. Automaton and Wasteland Workshop intensify many of the elements of customization that I found shallow and pointless, but it gave them so much attention that it finally clicked for me why other players from more contemporary gaming backgrounds might find more meaning in it than I do. Survival mode sharpened the base game into something much crueler, much more intense, more engaging than the regular rhythms of play. The slowness of it connected me to Fallout 4's design decisions in a much more impactful way than the regular game difficulties. And then Far Harbor, a real gift to someone like me, a massive and impressive thing that shows that Bethesda is entirely capable of designing a Fallout game that's family to what Black Isle and Obsidian have done, as opposed to the evolutionary offshoot that most people perceive it as, if they put in the care and attention that's needed. It's just that an astounding amount of care, thousands upon thousands of details, small and large, is needed to make a Fallout game feel like a Fallout game. To be experimental with it, as Fallout 4 is, invites frustration from folks like me. That doesn't mean we're always justified in being a grump about it, though. The ultimate scope of Fallout 4 is too huge to be reduced to one person's list of thrills and disappointments. Sometimes it's the Fallout I want, sometimes it isn't, but always underneath is solid and considered design and craftsmanship. It's not my favorite Fallout game, but I see now much more clearly how it could be someone else's thanks to the DLC. And thank you for watching. I'd like to take a moment to thank by name the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more to me on Patreon. My channel is entirely crowdfunded, and it's through these people's generosity that I'm able to keep doing what I'm doing and make videos like this. People like Cassie, Comfy Hat, Tom, Ron Gervais, Christian Zacharianson, Soaib Sheik, Pat Hay, Baldur Carlson, Dennis Clark, Dalton Seiler, Ken Young, Jake Brennan, Kevin DeBolt, Nick Cole-Hamilton, Brian Hill, Nobody, Kumarin Vishian, Justin Hughes, Niles D. McDonald, Igor Babuk, Andrew Steele, Jared Meyer, Jody Warren, Paul Cocker, Simo Polakowski, Rob Tackett, Stephen Potyak, Sasha Aya, Jake Mays, Divi Faust, Martin Markov, Brandon Boat, Alex Zalato, Colby Howard, Lee Jones, Yuri Petnis, John Walsh, Kumel, Pierce McBride, Jake Dobbs, Carl Gleason, Gordon Moon, D, Ariel Badger Release, Sharif Kazemi, Jack Harvey, Kyle Brown, Morgan, Nathaniel Tenzaro, Grenville Wilson, Alexander Heavens, Matthew, Rob Clark, Dylan Sidley, Tim Marsh, Devin Fitzpatrick, White Zero, Bradley Smith, Irvin, Matthew Zender, Pay, Alexander Dmitriov, Andreas Larson, Stephen Primo, Bob Belcher, David Gilbreth, Trivium Art History, Joshua Vivi, Harley McAvoy, Oliver Hendliken, Sangustin, Joe Wolf, Kimmo Heikkinen, Chris Larkey, Jeffrey Knudsen, Amir Aguilar, Stephen Lark, Preston Allen, Ryan Gutz, Brad Wallace, Nathan Campbell, Connor Biblow, Tizar Vicarian, Joe Hewison, Daniel Mower Myrie, Angel Headed Tipster, Cameron, Spyro Sedaris, Annex of Rhodes, Niels Bachfrummer, Dewey, Aiden AK-47, Josh Farkas, Ivan Marino, Brad Carr, Colin Lars Ingvar Anderson, Martin Scanning, Galak, Brett Gialmo, Martin Karsten, Jason K, Noah Duggins, Aaron Albach, Wesley M, Eugene Watson, I Cannot Fly, Alexander Leister, David Fry, Michael Atwell, Boris Nielsen, David Reed, and Cameron Jackson. Thanks again for watching. Was the villain, and the story plays out in its melodramatic and ridiculous way, whether that tone suits the player or not. So, the game lets the player adopt the secret identity, the Silver Shroud, whose ridiculousness feels more appropriate to the story. That said, Automaton is still more creative than just a high-budget version of the Superhuman Gambit quest. Focusing on robots, with their rigid, artificial, and sometimes delusional ways of looking at the world, helps highlight what's special about the Institute's technology and synths like Nick. In the beginning of the Automaton quest chain, you run across a robot who explains why the Mechanist armies are gunning down everyone in the Wasteland. They're here to help. The Mechanist has given them a simple instruction: help everyone in the Commonwealth. At first they were friendly, but more often than not, intervening in the lives of settlers and scavengers created more problems than it solved. Kindness was not helping. Life is hard and complicated. What would help everyone best is if they were all cold and in the ground. It's the simplest, most elegant solution if these robots are supposed to help absolutely everyone. Less people, less problems, no people, no problems. Wasteland helped. The question for the player is whether or not this is what the Mechanist intended. Are they a deliberate villain or a careless one? To discover the Mechanist layer, you'll have to build a robot that acts like a kind of walking key to the installation.
I don't wanna leave. Ooh, but she won't let me stay. Hey, yes, I don't wanna leave.
Hi, I'm Nojave. In this video, I'm going to be looking back through Fallout 4 and how it's changed now that all the DLC is out. I'm going to be looking at Automaton, at Far Harbor, at the Wasteland Workshop, and also at Survival Mode. We're going to be talking about how all of them change the base experience, or highlight certain portions of the base experience. Anyway, it's a long journey, so let's get started. I've always felt like the pulp comic book direction that Bethesda sometimes takes Fallout in is a bad one. It's not like it's out of place. The installation screen of the very first Fallout game is done up like a comic book cover itself, a man and woman in form-fitting vault suits climbing above a horde of ghouls in green mist. There's nothing amongst the silly, ridiculous stuff that Bethesda does in Fallout 3 and 4 that doesn't have an equally ridiculous counterpart in Fallout 2. Still, when I heard the first major Fallout 4 DLC would be bringing back the Mechanist from Fallout 3, I wasn't too happy about it. The shallow and melodramatic conflict between the Mechanist feeling that it was a well-designed game for someone else, that there was someone out there for whom Fallout 4 was the perfect Fallout experience, but I knew that person wasn't me. The new DLCs are very illuminating in trying to figure out the balance of the game. What makes Fallout 4 what it is and why? Each new piece of content pulls at a different thread of the Fallout 4 experience, takes an element that was evenly blended in the original version, and gives it focus and prominence. For Wasteland Workshop, it was the settlement mechanics. For Far Harbor, it was exploration and dialogue. For Survival Mode, it's combat and crafting. For Automaton, it's that comic book feel of the world. One of the most in-depth and well-liked quests of the base game is the Silver Shroud questline, where you don the gear of a pre-war masked Avenger. In the quest, you go around righting the wrongs that the post-apocalypse would otherwise let pass unnoticed and take down a ring of murderers and thieves, all the while leaving the Shroud's calling cards at the scene of the action. Automaton allows you to play through its entire length pretty much in character as the Silver Shroud. You can also play it straight and show up in power armor. The plot and different outcomes don't really change that much if you do, but you'll lose much of the spirit. Automaton is a superhero story, where instead of choosing between the Mechanist and Antagonizer, you, the player, are the protagonist, and the Mechanist is all. This will fork the DLC in its two directions, towards a pretty interesting but otherwise linear journey into the world of robotic ethics, and into a whole new customization suite just for robots at your settlement. The Mechanist layer is one of the few things in Fallout 4 that feels tightly connected to the lineage of the franchise as a whole, since it reaches deep into the Fallout tradition. In the Theyre Army Depot in Fallout 2, you had the opportunity to extract the brain of one of your traveling companions and stuff it into a robo-brain chassis, or else use one of the brains provided, sitting in storage for hundreds of years. Well, the Theyre Army Depot wasn't the only such facility. The Mechanist layer is where robo-brains were mass-produced, harvested from the brains of criminals and dissidents. As you explore the facility, you'll find logs from the various heads of robo-brain development and security, some of whom felt a zeal for progress at all costs, some of whom had moral objections and were ultimately removed from the project, and a few who were just regular old cowards, doing evil knowingly to collect the paycheck. Still, you learn the history of the robo-brains. Most of them are crazy, which is why the ones wandering the wastelands of previous games are so frequently hostile. It's brute force science, churning through hundreds and hundreds of human subjects, all of whom had their brains extracted. To Mechanist and the Antagonizer highlighted a wide range of complaints I have about the quality of writing in Bethesda Fallouts, primarily that it's based more on memorable concepts and deliberate gags than on detailed character and world building. Superheroes are a nifty-fifties kind of thing. Why not tap into the vibe of that late Golden Age, early Silver Age period of superhero comics? Put that in the game. In Fallout 3, the Mechanist was part of a straightforward quest chain called the Superhuman Gambit. Support the doer of good, or the doer of evil if you're into that, or kill both of them if they're annoying to you and you want their things. In Fallout 4, the Mechanist is a more complicated chain of quests with a more complicated set of motivations that helps flesh out the lore and depth of Fallout 4's particular focus on artificial life. It's smarter than Fallout 3, but it's more linear than most of Fallout 3 as well. The DLC of Fallout 4 really isn't what I expected on the whole. You've got Automaton, and then you've got the zero-plot customization expansion, Wasteland Workshop, and then finally you've got Far Harbor, which is no less than an honest-to-God expansion pack, roughly equivalent in depth, quality, and length to the Shivering Isles expansion for Elder Scrolls 4. There's also the free survival mode, which was recently patched in, which is like hardcore mode for New Vegas, but with more structural and mechanical changes. Fallout 4 itself was one of the biggest enigmas of a game I've played recently. I couldn't shake the